I found the receipt for my mother's funeral flowers tucked inside my sister-in-law's designer handbag, dated 3 days before my mother actually died. It wasn't a mistake or a pre-planning gesture of love. It was a line item in a budget for a life that Marin had already decided was over. I stood in the quiet of my brother's guest room, the leather of the bag cool against my palm, listening to the muffled sounds of the celebration of life happening downstairs. The scent of lilies was thick enough to taste cloying and funeral sweet. Marin had picked them, white lilies. My mother, Callista, had loathed them. She said they smelled like the end of things, but Marin liked how they looked in photos. I slipped the receipt back into the silk lining. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a cold, heavy stillness settled in my chest, the kind of weight you feel when you realize the floor you've been standing on is actually a trapdoor. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked under the weight of sympathizers, people from the country club who hadn't visited Mom once during her 3 years slide into the fog of dementia. I could hear my brother, Soren, his voice a low, practiced rumble of grief. He was good at this. He had the face for it, strong jaw, eyes that crinkled just right when he offered a somber nod. He was the successful son, the one who paid for the private nursing care, while I was the daughter who lived in the guest room for 18 months, wiping chin dribble and listening to the same 3 stories about 1974. I walked to the vanity and looked at myself. I looked tired. My hair, a dull chestnut, was pulled back too tight. I looked like the help, which, in Marin and Soren's eyes, was exactly what I had been. "Ria, are you coming down? People are asking for the saint of the sick room." Marin stood in the doorway. She was luminous in black silk, her blonde hair swept into a knot so perfect it looked structural. She didn't enter. She lingered on the threshold, as if my grief might be contagious. She held a glass of mineral water with a slice of lime. "I'll be down in a minute," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I just needed a second." "Of course, it's been a lot for you," she said, her tone patronizingly soft. "But Soren is about to do the toast. It would look odd if his only sister wasn't there, especially after everything we've done to make this day perfect." Everything we've done. She meant the caterers, the rented chairs, the flowers she bought while my mother was still breathing, her lungs rattling like a box of dry stones. "The flowers are beautiful, Marin," I said, turning to face her. "So white, so final." She smiled, a thin, sharp movement of her lips. "They're classic. Anyway, don't dawdle. The lawyer is coming by at 5. Soren wants to clear the air about the house. He thinks it's best if we move quickly for everyone's sake. You understand?" I understood perfectly. The house, a sprawling Victorian on the edge of the Sound, was the only thing Mom had left. It was also the only place I had to live. As Marin turned to glide back down the hallway, she left behind a trail of expensive perfume that smelled like ozone and ambition. I looked back at her bag on the bed. She had already moved her things into the master suite upstairs. My mother's body wasn't even in the ground yet, and the locks were already being mentally changed. I followed her down, my heels clicking on the hardwood Mom used to polish by hand. I wasn't going for the toast. I was going to see how many people in that room knew that the saint of the sick room was about to be evicted by her own blood. The living room was a sea of black wool and hushed murmurs. Soren stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the other cradling a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked like an ad for dignified mourning. When he saw me enter, he didn't move toward me. He simply tilted his head, a silent command for me to take my place at his side. "There she is," Soren said, his voice carrying just enough to silence the room. He placed a heavy, warm arm around my shoulders. It felt like a lead yoke. "My sister, Ria, the heart of this family. I don't know how she did it, day in and day out, watching our mother fade. Truly a devotion we could all learn from." A ripple of appreciative nods moved through the crowd. Mrs. Gable, a woman who hadn't called my mother in a decade, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I felt a sick heat rise in my throat. I wasn't a sister to him in that moment. I was a prop. I was the evidence of his own reflected goodness. If I was a saint, then he, the man who funded the sanctuary, must be a god. To Callista, Soren raised his glass, a woman who valued legacy above all else. To Callista, the room echoed. I didn't drink. I watched Marin through the crowd. She was standing near the buffet table, adjusted a tray of smoked salmon with a surgical precision. She caught my eye and gave a small, tight-lipped nod toward the hallway. The lawyer had arrived. 10 minutes later, the four of us were sequestered in the mahogany-paneled study. Mr. Sterling, a man whose suit looked older and more expensive than my car, laid out 3 leather-bound folders on the desk. The air in the room felt thin, used up. "I'll keep this brief," Mr. Sterling began, looking at me with a flicker of something that might have been pity. "Callista's will was updated 18 months ago, shortly after her diagnosis was finalized." I frowned. 18 months ago, I was her primary caregiver. I didn't know she'd seen anyone. "Soren handled the logistics, Rhea," Marin said smoothly, crossing her legs. "You were so busy with her medications and the laundry. We didn't want to burden you with the dry legalities." "The house," Soren interrupted, leaning forward. "Let's get to the point, Sterling." "The property," Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, "along with the remaining liquid assets, has been placed into a family trust. Soren is the sole trustee. The terms state that the property is to be liquidated at the trustee's discretion to settle outstanding debts, primarily the loans Soren provided for her care over the last 3 years." The room went very quiet. I could hear the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of the heating vent. "Loans," I whispered. "He told me he was taking care of her. He told me it was his contribution because he couldn't be here physically." Soren sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "Rhea, I poured hundreds of thousands into her doctors, her equipment, this very roof. I have a family to think about. Marin and I have sacrificed a lot to keep this place running for you and Mom." "You bought her flowers before she died, Soren," I said, the words slipping out before I could filter them. Soren's eyes narrowed. Marin's hand froze on her handbag. "What is that supposed to mean?" Marin asked, her voice dropping an octave. "It means I know exactly how much this sacrifice costs," I said, looking at the folders on the desk. "So, what's the timeline? When do I have to pack the sick room?" "We've already accepted an offer, Rhea," Soren said, his voice returning to its practiced, calm vibration. "A developer. They want to break ground before the frost. We'll need you out by the end of the month. But don't worry, Marin has found a lovely 1-bedroom apartment near the tracks. We've even offered to pay the first month's deposit. As a thank you." A 1-bedroom near the tracks. A severance package for 3 years of my life. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my brother, the man I used to chase through the beach grass until our lungs burned with salt air. He wasn't there anymore. There was only a landlord standing in his skin. "I see," I said, standing up. I didn't cry. The coldness from earlier had turned into a hard, crystalline clarity. "The end of the month. I'll make sure the saint is gone by then." I walked out of the study, but I didn't go back to the party. I went to my mother's sewing room, the only room Marin hadn't staged yet. I sat in the dark, surrounded by the scent of old cedar and thread, and reached into the hidden pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out a small, tarnished silver key I had taken from my mother's neck the hour after she passed. It didn't fit any door in this house, and it certainly didn't fit the lock Soren had just inherited. The house felt different after the lawyer left, thinner, as if the walls were already pulling away from the studs. Soren and Marin stayed downstairs late into the night, their voices drifting up the vents like smoke. They weren't mourning, they were auditing. I heard the clink of silverware as they moved through Mom's good china, deciding what was worth the commission and what was destined for a cardboard box on the curb. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the guest room, the small silver key biting into my palm. My mother had worn this key on a thin gold chain for 40 years. When she still had her mind, she'd touch it whenever she was anxious, a nervous habit that wore a smooth groove into the metal. Soren had assumed it was a religious medal and hadn't bothered to look closer when the funeral director handed over her personal effects. I knew this key didn't belong to the Victorian. This house had been bought with my father's life insurance. No, this key belonged to the before time, the years in the coastal cottage in Oakhaven that my mother had refused to speak about after my father died. At 2:00 a.m., when the house finally went silent, I crept into the hallway. I avoided the third step from the top. It groaned like a wounded animal, and made my way to the attic scuttle in the ceiling of the linen closet. The attic was a graveyard of things Marin found unbecoming. Dusty trunks, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and crates of my father's old architectural drawings. I pushed aside a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of mothballs and damp, revealing a small, unassuming cedar chest tucked under the eaves. It was tucked behind a mountain of Soren's old hockey trophies. He had forgotten it existed, but I remembered. I remembered Mom sitting in front of this chest on the anniversary of my father's death, her face illuminated by a single candle. I knelt on the rough floorboards, my knees aching. The silver key slid into the lock with a click that felt like a heartbeat. The lid creaked open. I expected jewelry or perhaps letters. Instead, the chest was filled with meticulous ledgers and a stack of weathered property deeds. I pulled out the top ledger. It wasn't my mother's handwriting. It was my father's, Caspian. As I flipped through the pages, the quiet sacrifice Soren had been bragging about downstairs began to dissolve. The ledgers documented a series of private investments my father had made in Soren's first tech startup 20 years ago. It wasn't a gift. It was a structured loan, with interest compounded, and a clause that stated the principal was to be returned to my mother's estate upon her death. But there was something else. Clipped to the back of the ledger was a carbon copy of a bank transfer dated 6 months ago. My heart hammered against my ribs. The transfer was for $50,000, moved from my mother's medical reserve account into a shell company called ML Designs. Marin Laurent Designs. Soren hadn't been funding her care with his own money. He had been cycling her own savings back into his wife's failing interior design business, then claiming those same amounts as loans to the estate. He was charging my mother for the privilege of stealing from her. I sat back, the cold air of the attic stinging my lungs. They hadn't just planned my eviction, they had orchestrated a financial assassination. They were counting on me being too tired, too grief-stricken, and too saintly to ever look at the books. A floorboard creaked behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the ledger. The flashlight beam in my hand flickered. Ria. Soren's voice was low, stripped of its public warmth. He was standing at the top of the attic stairs, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. He was still wearing his dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking like a man ready to get his hands dirty. "It's late," he said, his eyes tracking the open cedar chest. "What are you doing up here in the dust?" I didn't move. I kept my hand flat against the ledger, feeling the ghost of my father's ink beneath my palm. The attic felt smaller with Soren in it, the ceiling sloping down as if to crush us both. "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I thought I heard a noise. I think there's a leak in the eaves." Soren stepped further into the room. He didn't look at the roof. He looked at the silver key still hanging from the lock of the cedar chest. He walked over, his heavy footsteps vibrating through the floorboards, and stood directly over me. He reached down, his fingers brushing mine as he gripped the edge of the lid. "Mom's private things," he murmured, his eyes scanning the contents. I wondered where she'd hidden this. She was always so secretive toward the end. Paranoia is a cruel symptom, Ria. She wasn't paranoid when she packed this, Soren. This has been up here for years. He picked up a handful of the property deeds, thumbing through them with a casualness that made my skin crawl. "Old history, dust and paper. You shouldn't be up here breathing this in. It's not good for you." He closed the lid. The thud sounded like a gavel. He didn't lock it, but he kept his hand firmly on top of it. "Marin and I were talking. We think it's best if we start the estate sale this weekend. There's no point in dragging this out. It only makes the grieving process harder for you." "The weekend?" I stood up, brushing the gray dust from my knees. "The funeral was only 12 hours ago. Her tea kettle is still sitting on the stove, Soren." "And keeping it there won't bring her back," he snapped. The mask of the grieving son slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the harried, overextended businessman underneath. He took a breath, smoothing his expression. "Look, I know you're emotional, But I'm the one who has to answer to the creditors. I'm the one carrying the debt of this house. I need you to be the rational one. Can you do that for me?" He was doing it again, the rational brother versus the emotional sister. It was a role he'd cast me in since we were children. If I disagreed, I was unstable. If I cried, I was weak. "I'll be rational," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I'll start sorting her clothes tomorrow." "Good girl," he said, patting my shoulder. He reached out and plucked the silver key from the lock, dropping it into his pocket. "I'll take this. No need for you to worry about the archives." He waited for me to descend the stairs first, a mock gesture of chivalry that felt more like a shepherd herding a sheep. I went back to my room and closed the door, listening to his footsteps retreat toward the master suite. I sat in the dark, my heart racing. He thought he'd won because he had the key. But he was arrogant. He hadn't realized that while he was looking at the deeds, I had already slipped the bank transfer receipt for ML designs into the waistband of my leggings. I pulled the crumpled paper out, $50,000. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what this house was worth, but it was a paper trail. I realized then that I couldn't just leave. If I left at the end of the month, the house would be leveled, the records destroyed, and the saint of the sickroom would vanish into a drafty apartment by the tracks while Marin decorated her new condo with my mother's blood money. I needed to see the other side of that bank transfer, and I knew exactly who would have the records. My mother's oldest friend, Blythe, was a retired branch manager at the local bank. She had been the one to warn Mom about sharks in the water years ago. Marin had banned Blythe from visiting the house 6 months ago, claiming she agitated Mom. Now I knew why. I checked my phone. It was 3:15 a.m. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my car keys and my coat. If Soren was going to treat this like a business liquidation, then I was going to start an audit. The back door creaked as I slipped out into the chilly night air. The fog was rolling in off the sound, thick and white, just like the lilies in the living room. As I backed my old sedan down the driveway, I looked up at the master bedroom window. The light was on. A silhouette Marin was standing by the glass, watching me go. She didn't wave. She just stood there, a pale ghost in a house she hadn't yet earned. Blythe's house smelled of peppermint tea and the kind of stillness that only exists in the homes of the very old and the very lonely. She didn't seem surprised to find me on her doorstep before sunrise. She just opened the door, her quilted robe pulled tight, and ushered me into a kitchen filled with ceramic cats and vintage calendars. "I've been waiting for you to wake up, Rhea," she said, her voice a low rasp. She set the crumpled bank transfer receipt I'd found on the table between us. "I saw Marin's car at the bank drive through back in November. She didn't see me. She was using your mother's power of attorney like a golden ticket." "How deep does it go, Blythe?" I asked, my fingers tracing the edge of a chipped coaster. "Soren said he was loaning the estate money. He's using that to claim the entire value of the house." Blythe reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. "Your mother wasn't as far gone as they wanted people to think. Last summer, during one of those afternoons when you were out getting her prescriptions, she called me. She was terrified, Rhea. Not of the shadows or the forgetting. She was terrified of Soren's help." She slid a stack of photocopied statements across the table. I scanned the columns of numbers, my stomach twisting. It was a systematic bleeding. Small withdrawals at first, 500 here, 1,000 there. Then, as Mom's condition worsened, the numbers ballooned. She had me make copies of her original medical reserve accounts before Soren took over the management, Blythe whispered. "Look at the dates." I looked. The loans Soren claimed to have made for Mom's private nursing weren't loans at all. He had been withdrawing money from Mom's own retirement fund, moving it into his personal account, and then paying the nursing agency from there. He was creating a paper trail that made it look like the money was coming from his pocket, while the source was actually Mom's life savings. He was laundering her own inheritance to steal the equity in her home. And this, Blythe pointed to a line item from October. A wire transfer to a luxury car dealership in the city, $48,000. I remembered the consolation gift Soren had bought Marin that month, a sleek, midnight blue SUV. He had told me it was a reward for how hard she was working to manage the family's stress. "They've stripped her dry," I said, the coldness in my chest hardening into a sharp, jagged edge. "There's nothing left but the house, and they're selling that to a developer to bury the evidence. If that house is sold and the estate is settled, the paper trail dies with it," Blythe said. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her skin felt like parchment. "You're the only one who can stop the clock, Rhea, but you have to be careful. Soren isn't just greedy, he's desperate. I've heard rumors at the club his firm is under internal audit. He needs this house to plug a very big hole." I left Blythe's house as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple and orange. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the shore and sat in my car, watching the tide come in. I thought about the last 3 years. I thought about the nights I'd spent sleeping on a cot next to Mom's bed, listening to her breathe, while Soren and Maren sent check-in texts from 5-star resorts. I thought about how they had looked at me with pity, the poor, stagnant sister who had no career, no husband, no life. They thought I was a martyr. They thought I was a servant. But a servant knows every corner of the house. A servant knows where the silver is hidden and which floorboards creak. And a servant knows exactly how to poison the well. When I finally pulled back into the driveway of the Victorian, Soren's SUV was gone. Maren's car sat there, gleaming and arrogant. I walked into the kitchen and found her at the island, sipping a green juice and scrolling through a digital catalog of minimalist modern furniture. "Late night?" she asked without looking up. Her voice was light, but there was a predatory tension in her shoulders. "Just saying goodbye to the water," I said, walking to the coffee pot. I poured a cup, the steam rising into my face. "I was thinking about what you said, Maren, about moving quickly. You're right. We should start the estate sale today. In fact, I'll start with the basement. There's so much old history down there." Maren's thumb paused on her screen. She looked up, her blue eyes scanning my face for a trap. "The basement? I thought we'd start with the dining room. The crystal is worth more." "The basement has the records," I said, giving her a small, tired smile. "Mom's old tax files, the house's original blueprints, and the receipts for the renovations Soren did 5 years ago. We'll need those for the developer, right?" The color drained from Maren's face so slowly it was almost artistic. She knew exactly what was in those files, and she knew I was no longer just the saint of the sickroom. "I'll help you," she said, sliding off her stool. "We'll do it together." "I'd like that," I said. "Family should always stick together." Basement was a concrete labyrinth that smelled of damp earth and the heavy, metallic tang of an old furnace. It was the only part of the house Maren hadn't touched. She hated the low ceilings and the way the shadows seemed to cling to her silk blouses. As we descended the wooden stairs, her heels made a hollow, precarious sound. "It's a disaster down here," Maren muttered, waving a hand in front of her face as if to ward off the very air. "Soren should have hired a professional crew to clear this out weeks ago." "Soren wanted to save money," I reminded her, my voice echoing. "Remember, every penny counts for the estate." I led her to the far corner, where a stack of gray filing cabinets stood like sentinels. I knew these cabinets. They contained the debris of my father's life and the meticulously filed shadows of Soren's early career. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It shrieked, a metal-on-metal protest that made Maren flinch. "Here they are," I said, pulling out a thick accordion-style folder. "The 2020-12023 medical logs. And look, here's the folder for ML Designs." Maren stepped forward, her composure fracturing. She reached for the folder, but I didn't hand it over. I held it against my chest, feeling the sharp corners of the paper through the cardboard. "Why would Soren keep my business files in Mom's basement?" she asked, her voice reaching a pitch that was just slightly too high to be casual. "I imagine it was for tax purposes," I said, tilting my head. "Since the money used to consult for your business came from Mom's medical reserve, it had to be filed somewhere. It's clever, really. If anyone looked, it just looked like Mom was investing in her daughter-in-law's future, a gift from a doting mother." Maren's eyes darted toward the stairs. She was calculating the distance. Rhea, give me the folder. You don't understand how complicated corporate accounting is. You've been out of the loop for a long time. I've been in a sick room, Marin, not a coma. I opened the folder slowly. I see a lot of invoices here for aesthetic wellness consulting for Mom. $50,000 for what exactly? Redecorating her bedroom while she couldn't even recognize her own reflection in the mirror. She deserved a beautiful environment, Marin snapped, her mask finally shattering. Soren and I worked ourselves to the bone to make sure she had the best. If we took a management fee, it was well earned. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain our lifestyle while propping up this mausoleum? Our lifestyle, I repeated. I looked at her, really looked at her. The jewelry, the skin that had been lasered and plumped into a porcelain lie, the desperation vibrating under her skin. You didn't prop up this house, Marin. You bled it. And now you're trying to burn the evidence by selling to a developer who will bulldoze these filing cabinets along with the walls. Marin took a step toward me, her hand curling into a fist. You think you're so righteous, but you're nothing. You have no money, no job, and by the end of the month, no home. Who is going to believe the ramblings of a grieving, unemployed daughter against a man like Soren? The bank might, I said quietly, or the IRS, or perhaps the other board members at Soren's firm who are currently auditing his internal expenses. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of a leaky pipe behind the furnace. Marin's face went from pale to a mottled, ugly red. You went to Blythe, she whispered. That old hag. Blythe is a friend, I said, and friends keep records. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A heavy shaft of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing between us. Marin, Soren's voice boomed down the stairs, stripped of its public charm. Why is your car blocking the driveway? And why the hell is the lawyer calling me about a discrepancy in the trust's title? I looked at Marin. She looked at the folder in my hands. The game had moved from the shadows into the light, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the one who was afraid. Soren descended the stairs, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened. He stopped halfway down, squinting into the dimness of the basement. He looked between me and Marin, his eyes landing on the accordion folder clutched to my chest. The discrepancy the lawyer had mentioned was clearly eating at him. I could see the pulse jumping in his temple. What's going on down here? He demanded. Marin, you look like you've seen a ghost. Your sister has been playing detective, Soren, Marin said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and venom. She pointed a manicured finger at me. She's been talking to Blythe. She has the ML Designs files. Soren's expression shifted instantly. The weary businessman vanished, replaced by something cold and predatory. He finished the descent, his polished shoes crunching on the grit of the concrete floor. He didn't stop until he was inches from me, using his height to shadow me. Rhea, he said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. Give me the folder. I don't think so, Soren, I said, backing up until my spine hit the cold metal of the filing cabinet. I think these belong to the estate, and since you're the sole trustee, I'm sure you'll want to explain to the probate judge why Mom was paying for your wife's office rent and a midnight blue SUV. Soren laughed, but it was a dry, hollow sound. You're out of your depth. Those were legitimate business expenses for the management of Mom's care. Everything is documented. Everything is legal. Is the wire transfer to the car dealership legal? I asked. Is the fact that you used Mom's medical reserve as a personal piggy bank while telling me we couldn't afford the night shift nurse legal? I sat in that room alone, Soren. I watched her struggle to breathe while you were signing over her life savings to cover your own internal audits at work. Soren's hand shot out, gripping the edge of the filing cabinet right next to my head. I did what I had to do to keep this family afloat. You lived here for free. You ate her food, you used her electricity, and you didn't contribute a single cent. You were a glorified babysitter, Rhea. Don't you dare judge me for how I managed the stress of carrying all of you. I wasn't a babysitter, I whispered, the heat of my anger finally breaking through the ice. I was her daughter, something you stopped being the moment you saw her as a line item. I moved to sidestep him, but he blocked me, his face inches from mine. You're going to hand over that folder, and you're going to accept the apartment Marin found for you. If you go to the authorities, I will tie you up in court for a decade. I have the resources. You have nothing. By the time a judge looks at those papers, I'll have made sure you look like the one who took advantage of a demented old woman. He's right, Rhea, Marin added, stepping up beside him. The two of them stood like a wall. Think about your reputation. The saint who is actually stealing from the till. It's a much more believable story than a successful CEO risking his career for a few $1,000s. I looked at them, my brother and the woman he'd chosen. They were so convinced of their power that they couldn't see the cracks in the foundation they were standing on. You're right about one thing, Soren, I said, reaching into the folder. I don't have your resources, but I do have Mom's phone, the one she used to record her messages when she was feeling lonely. I pulled out the old smartphone, the screen cracked but the power light blinking green. She wasn't just paranoid, Soren. She was documenting. She recorded the conversation you had with her last July, the one where you pressured her to sign the power of attorney while she was crying because she didn't know who you were. The silence in the basement became absolute. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of my brother. Give me the phone, Soren hissed, reaching for it. I didn't flinch. I held it over the open sump pump pit behind the furnace, a dark hole filled with oily, stagnant water. One more step, and it goes in, and then I'll just have to rely on the copies I already uploaded to the cloud while I was at Blythe's. I was lying about the cloud, but as I watched the sweat break out on Soren's forehead, I realized that in a house built on lies, the biggest lie is always the one you're most afraid to believe. Soren's hand hovered in midair, his fingers twitching like a gambler who had just realized the deck was stacked. The bravado that had sustained him for years, the tailored suits, the expensive scotch, the booming voice, seemed to wilt under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the basement. You're bluffing, he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Mom didn't even know how to unlock that phone by last summer. She didn't have to, I replied, my thumb hovering over the play button. I set it for her. I told her it was a diary so she wouldn't feel so alone when I had to run errands. She captured everything, Soren. Every time you raised your voice because she couldn't remember your name. Every time Marin told her she was a burden while sliding a new contract under her pen. Marin let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. This is insane. Soren, do something. She's trying to blackmail us. It's not blackmail when you're just returning stolen property, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly whisper. I don't want your money, Soren. I don't want the midnight blue SUV or the designer handbags. I want what's fair. I want the trust dissolved and the house sold on the open market, with the proceeds distributed as Dad's original ledgers intended. Soren's eyes darted to the sump pump pit, then back to the phone. He was calculating the risk of lunging for me. He was a man used to winning through intimidation, but he was standing on wet concrete in a basement that held 20 years of family secrets. He knew that if even a fraction of what I said was true, his career wouldn't just be over. He'd be facing elder abuse charges. If we sell the house on the open market, Soren said, his voice straining for a deal, it could take months. The developer is ready to move now. If you sign off, I'll double your share of the remaining liquid assets. You could buy a place of your own, somewhere nice, not near the tracks. I don't want a bribe to help you cover a crime, I said. I want you to call the developer and tell them the deal is off. Then, I want you to call Mr. Sterling and tell him there's a new executor for the estate. Me. Over my dead body, Marin spat. We've spent years building our reputation. We aren't going to let a house sitter ruin us because she has a few recordings of a confused old woman. It's not just the recordings, Marin, I said, finally pulling the trump card I'd been holding since I left Blythe's. Blythe didn't just give me bank statements. She gave me the contact information for the compliance officer at Soren's firm. It turns out they've been looking for the source of a specific $48,000 reimbursement that hit your company account last fall. Soren's face didn't just go pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray. He stepped back, his hand falling away from the filing cabinet. The wall of his arrogance had finally crumbled, revealing the terrified, cornered man behind it. "Rhea, please," he whispered. "Don't do that. If they find out, I'll lose everything. The house, the career, the kids' tuition, everything." "You already lost the only thing that mattered," I said, looking at the man who used to be my brother. "You lost the right to call yourself her son." I walked past him. He didn't try to stop me this time. I climbed the stairs, the folder tucked under my arm and the phone gripped tight in my hand. I could hear Marin's sharp, panicked whispers starting up behind me, the two of them already turning on each other like rats in a rising tide. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the island where Marin had been scrolling through furniture earlier. I picked up the landline, the old-fashioned one Mom refused to get rid of, and dialed the lawyer's number. "Mr. Sterling," I said when he answered, "this is Rhea. I think we need to have a very different conversation about the loans to the estate, and you might want to bring a forensic accountant. My brother is ready to cooperate." I hung up and looked out the window. The fog was finally lifting, revealing the cold, gray beauty of the Sound. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about the next dose of medication or the next pile of laundry. I was thinking about the locks. I was going to change every single one of them. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold coffee and the sharp, rhythmic sound of a shredder that Soren and Marin didn't know I had hidden in the library. They stayed in the master suite, the door locked, the silence between us so heavy it felt like a physical presence in the hallways. When they did emerge, they moved like shadows, avoiding my gaze, their footsteps hurried and hollow. Mr. Sterling arrived on Tuesday morning, accompanied by a woman named Nishka, a forensic accountant with iron-gray hair and eyes that saw through every gilded lie. We sat in the dining room, the very place where Soren had toasted to legacy just days before. I laid everything out, the ledgers from the attic, the bank transfers from Blythe, and the recordings. I didn't embellish. I didn't have to. The numbers spoke a language of greed that required no translation. "This is extensive," Nishka said, her pen hovering over a line item for home health consultation that matched the price of Marin's new kitchen renovation. She looked up at Soren, who sat at the far end of the table, his skin looking sallow under the chandelier. "Mr. Vance, do you have the original invoices for these expenditures? Because these don't align with any reputable nursing agency in the state." Soren didn't look at her. He looked at the mahogany table, his fingers tracing a scratch in the wood. I may have miscategorized some things. It was a chaotic time." "Chaos isn't a legal defense for embezzlement, Soren," Mr. Sterling said, his voice surprisingly stern. He looked at me, then back at Soren. "Rhea is offering you a choice. You sign over your rights as trustee and return the $50,000 funneled into ML Designs. In exchange, she won't hand these files over to your firm's compliance board or the district attorney." Marin, who had been sitting by the window, turned sharply. "That's everything we have. If we give that back, we'll have to sell our own house. We'll be ruined." "You were ruined the second you decided a dying woman was an ATM," I said quietly. The room went silent. Marin looked at Soren, waiting for him to fight, to yell, to use that alpha corporate energy he was so proud of. But Soren was a man built on a foundation of stolen sand. He looked broken. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw the boy he used to be, the one who was afraid of the dark. "I'll sign," he whispered. "Soren, no." Marin stepped forward, her face a mask of fury. "She's bluffing. She won't send her own brother to jail." "Try me, Marin," I said. "I've spent 3 years watching a woman disappear piece by piece while you picked over her bones. I have nothing left to lose. Do you?" Marin stopped. She looked at the designer heels she was wearing, then at the folders on the table. She realized, finally, that the saint had developed a very sharp edge. The paperwork took hours. By sunset, Soren was no longer the trustee. The house was back in the name of the estate, with me as the sole executor. The developer's contract was voided. As the lawyers left, Soren stood in the foyer, a single suitcase by his side. Marin had already stormed out to the car, her tires screeching on the gravel. He looked around the entryway, at the height marks notched into the doorframe from when we were kids, at the oil painting of the sound that Mom loved. "Are you going to stay here?" he asked, his voice thin. "For a while," I said, "until I decide what Mom would have actually wanted. But you need to leave the keys, Soren, all of them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of keys. He set them on the side table. Among them was the small silver key he'd taken from the attic. "I'm sorry, Rhea," he said. He didn't sound like he meant it. He sounded like a man who was sorry he got caught. "Goodbye, Soren," I said. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in years. I walked back into the kitchen, which was now completely silent. No hum of medical equipment, no rattling breath, just the quiet of a house that was finally, legally, mine to protect. But as I sat down, I realized there was one more thing in the cedar chest I hadn't looked at. A small, sealed envelope at the very bottom, addressed to me in my mother's shaky, late-stage handwriting. My heart hammered as I tore it open. It wasn't a legal document. It was a map. The map was hand-drawn on the back of an old grocery receipt, the lines shaky but deliberate. It didn't lead to a treasure chest or a hidden safe. It led to a coordinates point on the rocky shoreline of Oakhaven, 3 miles north of the house. Beside the sketch, she had written 4 words, "Where the salt heals." I spent my first night of true solitude in the Victorian. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the phantom sound of a call bell or the heavy, judging footsteps of my brother. I woke up to the sun. It spilled across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes that finally seemed at rest. I drove to Oakhaven at noon. The air there was different, sharper, laced with the scent of brine and decaying kelp. I followed the map past the weathered boardwalk and down a narrow path choked with sea rose and beach plum. The coordinates led to a small, secluded cove where the tide was currently retreating, leaving behind tide pools that mirrored the pale blue sky. Tucked into a crevice of the sea wall was a weathered copper canister, green with age and salt spray. My mother must have hidden it years ago, back when her mind was still a library and not a labyrinth. Inside was a letter and a single, heavy gold coin, a sovereign from my father's collection. But the letter was the real inheritance. "Rhea, my quiet girl, if you are reading this, the noise has finally stopped. I saw how they looked at you, as if you were a shadow in your own life. But shadows are the only things that stay when the lights go out. I knew Soren would try to take the roof from over your head. I knew Maren would try to take the clothes from your back. I couldn't stop them with my words toward the end, but I kept one secret for you." The letter detailed a small, private life insurance policy she had taken out in my name only decades ago. It wasn't millions, but it was enough. It was a bridge to a life where I didn't have to be a martyr. "Sell the house, Rhea. Don't stay in the museum of my decline. Go to the water, buy something small. Buy something that is only yours. You gave me your youth, I am giving you your freedom. Let the salt wash the rest away." I sat on the rocks for a long time, the paper fluttering in the wind. I felt a strange, hollow lightness. The revenge I had sought, the auditing, the confrontation, the quiet destruction of Soren's reputation, felt like a heavy coat I was finally allowed to take off. I had won the house, but the house was a cage. My mother had known that better than anyone. A month later, the Victorian was sold. Not to a developer who wanted to pave over the memories, but to a young family who saw the beauty in the creaky floorboards and the high ceilings. I watched from the driveway as the "For Sale" sign was taken down. Soren and Maren were gone. They had moved to a rented townhouse in a different city, their empire reduced to a desperate attempt to stay out of the newspapers. I hadn't spoken to them since the day the keys were surrendered. Some betrayals are too deep for a bridge to span. Some silences are healthier than a conversation. I moved into a small cottage in Oakhaven, just like Mom had suggested. It has a porch that faces the sound and a small garden where I grow lavender instead of lilies. The silver key now sits in a bowl on my entryway table next to my new keys. I don't use it for anything, but I like the weight of it. It reminds me that I am no longer the saint of the sickroom. I am not a servant, or a shadow, or a prop in someone else's drama. The morning air in Oakhaven is cold, but as I stand on my porch with a cup of coffee that stays hot as long as I want it to, I realize the weight in my chest is gone. The salt didn't just heal the memories, it preserved the woman I was always meant to be. I am Ria, and for the first time in my life, I am home.